We're talking about Chukwuemeka Udemegu Ojukwu. As a military officer, a politician, and the leader of the breakaway Republic of Biafra, his story is basically woven right into the very fabric of Nigeria's modern history. So we're going to rely strictly on the historical record, academic discourse analysis, and timeline events to figure out exactly who he was and the massive historical forces that collided around him. Let's get right into it. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the making of a leader, move into the road to secession, then the birth of a republic, the power of words, and finally wrap things up with a contested historical legacy. Section 1, the making of a leader and the duality of Ojukwu's early years. To really grasp who Ojukwu was, we absolutely have to understand the completely contrasting worlds he navigated right from the jump. What's so wild about his background is this extreme duality. On one hand, you've got absolute top-tier privilege. He was the son of Sir Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu, a transport magnate who was essentially the richest man in Nigeria at the time. Emeka, as he was known, was educated at King's College in Lagos, sent off to the UK, and actually earned a master's degree in history from Oxford University. But then, on the flip side, in 1957, instead of just, sliding into some comfortable corporate executive role, he completely walks away from that privilege. He chose the rigorous, gritty life of a military recruit. He was actually one of the very first university graduates to join the Nigerian military, and he insisted on doing it from the absolute bottom up. And because of that unique background, his ascent through the ranks was incredibly rapid. Born in 1933, holding an Oxford degree by 1955, and joining the military in 1957. Thanks to his education, he was promoted pretty quickly. He served in the UN peacekeeping force in the Congo and eventually made it to lieutenant colonel. By January 1966, he was appointed the military governor of the Eastern region. So practically overnight, he becomes this central figure in a rapidly changing and honestly increasingly volatile nation. Moving on to Section 2, the road to secession and the collapse of the First Republic. You see, Ojukwu's rise to regional leadership happened to collide with one of the most unstable, violent periods in Nigerian history, where the whole post-independence political structure was severely fractured by regional and ethnic divides. In 1966, this chaotic chain reaction was set off. It started with Step 1, a January coup led mostly by junior Igbo officers. Now, it was pitched as an anti-corruption move, right? But the selective assassination of northern and western political leaders ignited this really fierce ethnic mistrust. Then comes Step 2, the so-called July rematch. This was a counter-coup by northern officers that resulted in the death of the head of state, and Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon was put into power. That directly led to Step 3, horrific pogroms in the north. Thousands of Easterners, primarily Igbos, were massacred. This triggered a massive exodus right back to the eastern region, where Ojukwu was governor. By this point, the fragile trust holding the Nigerian Federation together was just entirely shattered. Desperately trying to avert an all-out civil war, the leadership agreed to meet on neutral ground in Aburi, Ghana, in January 1967. And Ojukwu arrived meticulously prepared. He brought legal advisors, political advisors, and really used his deep constitutional knowledge to push for a decentralized Confederate structure. He essentially tactically outmaneuvered Gowon, who was just relatively unprepared for the extreme nuances of this constitutional debate, and Ojukwu has secured agreements that basically granted the regional autonomy he felt was absolutely necessary to protect the Easterners. But here's the crucial turning point. When Gowon got back to Lagos, his advisors laid out the actual implications of what he just agreed to. So he reneged on full implementation. Instead, he passed Decree 8, which altered the agreements to maintain much stronger federal control. This triggered a really dramatic standoff. Ojukwu vowed from Enugu, "On Aburi we stand," to which Gowon countered from Lagos, "From Aburi you shall fall." This ultimate breakdown of trust became the definitive catalyst for the looming conflict. Which brings us to Section 3, Birth of a Republic, covering the declaration and the sheer toll of the war. With diplomatic negotiations totally collapsed, a devastating new chapter began. The debate wasn't about political structure anymore. For the East, it was now framed entirely as a matter of absolute survival. So on May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu formally declared the independence of the Republic of Biafra. And it's really important to note exactly how he framed this. He didn't pitch it as an act of rebellion. Rather, he presented it as a desperate, forced measure to guarantee the peace, survival, and security of his people against a federal government he claimed could no longer protect them. In response to this declaration, the Nigerian federal government immediately declared war to keep the country united. The human reality of that political decision was just devastating. 30. That's the number of months this brutal civil war lasted. It was characterized by overwhelming odds stacked against Biafra, including a total land, sea, and air blockade imposed by the federal government and a completely paralyzing famine. The conflict ultimately claimed millions of lives, and tragically, a huge number of those were non-combatants, women and children who succumbed to starvation. It became a profound humanitarian catastrophe that gripped the entire world's attention. Section 4. The power of words and how rhetoric was used as a weapon of war. Despite those overwhelming odds, a massive lack of weaponry, and widespread starvation, Biafra actually sustained its revolution for those full 30 months. You have to wonder, how does a population keep fighting under those conditions? Well, a major factor was Ojukwu's masterful use of ideological communication. To really understand how he built this psychological resilience, we can turn to an academic critical discourse analysis of his speeches. This basically pulls back the curtain, letting us examine exactly how language itself was deployed to sustain a massive war effort. Researchers actually applied Toon Van Dyke's ideological square framework to Ojukwu's speeches. This linguistic strategy shows how a leader can polarize a conflict to unify their own group. Ojukwu constantly emphasized our good things, framing Biafrans as proud, heroic, and innocent defenders. At the exact same time, he emphasized their bad things, painting the Nigerian forces as wicked oppressors purposely using starvation as a weapon. Meanwhile, he meticulously glossed over or de-emphasized any flaws on the Biafran side. This relentless us versus them categorization was an incredibly effective way to control the narrative and keep morale from collapsing. You can actually see this powerful linguistic tactic in action in his January 1970 handover message. The quote here objectively justifies the war as a forced necessity for self-determination. But what the discourse analysis really highlights is the heavy use of euphemisms. I mean, at this point, Biafra was completely collapsing. But instead of saying, "We're defeated and I have to flee," Ojukwu framed his departure to the Ivory Coast as going in search of peace, to protect the self-image of the Biafran people. It was a masterful, albeit tragic, use of language to manage an incredibly dire reality. He used a similar, but honestly much broader, rhetorical approach a year earlier in the 1969 Ahira Declaration. Here, Ojukwu elevated their local, regional conflict into this massive global narrative. He framed the Biafran struggle not just as a regional dispute, but as the front line of the black man's struggle against racism, Arab-Muslim expansionism, and white economic imperialism. He forcefully lambasted foreign powers for supporting the blockade, brilliantly appealing to global progressive movements by turning Biafra into the ultimate symbol of self-determination. Finally, Section 5, a contested historical legacy and the echoes of Ojukwu. Biafra ultimately surrendered in January 1970. Ojukwu handed over power to Major General Philip Ifyang and went into exile. The war was officially over, but it left behind an incredibly complex footprint that historians, politicians, and everyday citizens are still hotly debating today. As an impartial explainer, we really have to look at the deeply polarized legacy he left behind. To many in the East, he remains a messianic hero, a brave defender who stood up when his people faced extermination, doing exactly what he felt was necessary to ensure their survival. But conversely, to many others across Nigeria, he is viewed as an opportunistic architect of secession. To them, he was a man whose ambition plunged the nation into a completely avoidable war that cost millions of lives while also oppressing non-Igbo minorities within the region. Both of these perspectives are etched permanently into the historical discourse. But, even after fleeing to the Ivory Coast at the war's end, his story didn't actually end there. After 13 long years in political exile, Ojukwu was granted an official presidential pardon in 1982. He returned to Nigeria to a massive welcome in the East, and he spent his final decades attempting to actively participate in Nigeria's democratic process, even running for office several times. When he died in 2011 at the age of 78, he was buried with full military honors, ironically, by the very army he had once fought against. So as we wrap up this explainer of Chukwuemeka Odumegu Ojukwu's life, from the extreme privileges of Oxford all the way to the tragedy of a 30-month war, and the Iburi failures that are still echoing in modern Nigerian debates about federalism, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. How does the language of a leader, the exact rhetoric used to forge a nation in the absolute crucible of war, continue to shape a people's identity decades after the guns have fallen silent? Think about that for a minute and keep exploring the history around you.